In 1985, the world heard that Titanic had finally been found. Sounds simple, right? Like the story ended there. But the first images rising from the floor of the Atlantic didn't just reveal a location. They carried a very different feeling. That there was something in that scene the public still hadn't fully understood. Because finding the ship was only the beginning.
The Titanic was found in 1985, but almost no one saw what really appeared down there.
For decades, Titanic existed more as a shared memory than as something real and locatable. Everyone knew the name, the route, the tragedy, the scale of the symbol. But knowing the story and finding the ship were two completely different things. The absence of the hull on the seafloor fed a kind of modern legend, almost as if the disaster were too immense to fit into one exact point in the ocean. And that creates a strange effect. The bigger the myth, the simpler it starts to feel in people's minds. But the Atlantic doesn't care about popular memory. It demands precision, method, and an extraordinary amount of endurance. The problem was not just getting down to extreme depths. It was searching for something enormous in a vast, dark, hostile area that offered no technical mercy at all. The depth was brutal, the pressure was crushing, and visibility depended entirely on the technology available. Have you ever tried to find something while knowing you might be looking in the wrong place? Now take that feeling thousands of feet below the surface. The search for Titanic did not fail because of a lack of interest. It failed because the challenge was simply too big for simplistic approaches. Finding the ship required more than courage. It required a whole new way of thinking about the problem. That was exactly where the logic of the search began to change. Instead of insisting on the idea of finding the whole ship at once, the team started working with a smarter hypothesis. Before the hull, there would be traces. Before the famous image, there would be a trail. And that changes the entire operation. Because a shipwreck of this scale, at such depth, does not leave behind just a single point of interest. It leaves a field. It leaves fragments, patterns, a spread of materials. The mission starts to look more like an underwater forensic investigation. And once that key turns, the search stops being a blind gamble and becomes the reading of evidence. Even with a better strategy, the wear and tear on board remained intense. Hours staring at screens, repetition, coordinates, cross-checks, almost no return. The dark sea outside and monitors inside that gave very little back. It was the kind of operation where failure did not arrive in one dramatic explosion, but as accumulated exhaustion. Little by little, doubt starts creeping in. What if the area is wrong? What if the original reading drifted away from the real location? And that weighs more heavily than it seems, because the team was not facing depth alone. They were facing error, fatigue, and the risk of passing dangerously close to the answer without recognizing it in time. Then shapes begin to appear that the ocean floor, by itself, could not explain. Small elements, curves of metal, matter arranged in a way that was unmistakably human. It still was not the sweeping image the public would eventually expect. And maybe that is exactly why the moment hit so hard. Because the shift in mood did not come with spectacle. It came with technical recognition. The emptiness was no longer empty. The seafloor was starting to answer back, and once that first clue appears, the entire search changes state. It is no longer about abstract hope. Now there is signal, there is pattern, there is the real possibility that Titanic is finally beginning to reveal itself. From that point on, the image began to take shape little by little, without the kind of clean reveal movies love so much. First a line, then a structure, then enough detail to rule out the idea of ordinary scrap. And that matters, because the discovery of Titanic did not happen as one finished scene. It assembled itself in front of the team, layer by layer, with an almost dry kind of force. And maybe that is where the real impact lives. What appeared on that screen did not feel like fiction, illustration, or retelling. It felt like proof. It felt like raw material correcting decades of comfortable imagination. When the bow finally imposes itself in the image, the mission crosses an emotional and historical line at the same time. There was Titanic, not as a drawing, a model, or a collective memory, but as a physical presence on the floor of the Atlantic. The scale fits. The material reality fits. The visual weight fits. But that immediate recognition brings a second feeling with it, one much harder to process. Because the bow is impressive, yes, but it is also isolating. It does not seem to tell the whole story by itself. It works as confirmation and at the same time, as warning. The ship has been found, but the story is not finished. In fact, it is about to become much more complicated. Around the main structure, a debris field began to appear, and it changed the meaning of the discovery in a major way. Scattered objects, small pieces, fragments of everyday use, and displaced structures started building a completely different kind of reading. This was no longer just the discovery of an icon. It was the reading of a site. And in this context, site means material context, trajectory, violence of process, dispersion. The seafloor was not preserving only a striking image. It was preserving evidence. That is the kind of detail that separates popular storytelling from serious historical work. Because the sea does not give you emotion alone. It gives you pattern, and pattern has to be interpreted. At this point, the classic image many people carried in their minds of Titanic starts to lose its stability. Some imagined a great, recognizable body, almost resting in solemn silence, as if the entire ship had simply waited there to be found again. But the real site told a different story. The arrangement of materials, the empty spaces between major sections, and the spread of the remains pointed to a reality far more complex. And honestly, that hits hard. Because finding Titanic was already a landmark. Discovering that it did not match the Titanic of popular imagination was an even greater historical shock. The public wanted confirmation. The seafloor was offering correction. This is where the discovery rises to another level. We are no longer talking only about a location celebrated in headlines. We are talking about a body of images that begins to reopen the entire understanding of the disaster. What appears on the floor of the Atlantic does not just say, "It was here." It asks, what really happened before it came to rest here? If this kind of evidence-based reconstruction pulls you in, this is the point where the story becomes even stronger. Because from here on out, the mission leaves the territory of historic announcement and enters the most unsettling, most fascinating, and most serious ground of all, the material interpretation of what the sea preserved. The turning point comes when the team realizes they are not looking only at a great discovery, but at a major historical correction. The find would already have been monumental if it had done nothing more than locate the ship. But the images were doing more than that. They were starting to correct expectations, weaken simplifications, and move the popular narrative onto far more technical ground. It is the kind of moment that sends a strange chill through you. Because evidence does not always arrive just to confirm a story. Sometimes it arrives to show that the story had been incomplete from the very beginning. And that is exactly the feeling that started settling over the mission. This is the true apex of the video. The shock does not come only from the image of the bow, but from the relationship between the bow, the debris field, and the empty spaces separating the major elements of the site. That was the moment the mission stopped being only a technological triumph and became a first-rate historical revelation. The floor of the Atlantic was showing that the real Titanic was less orderly. Less stable, and far more brutal than much of the public had imagined. This kind of discovery carries weight because it reaches into collective memory. It is not just an answer. It is an answer that forces an entire rethink of how the question had been asked in the first place. Without relying on visual spectacle, the site itself allowed a logic of collapse to be reconstructed. Separated structures, displaced objects, marked sediments, and heavy masses settled into positions that did not suggest simple rest. Nothing needed to shout. The material spoke for itself. And that point is essential to the tone of the video. The sea was not giving back a ready-made dramatic scene, but a forensic one. The team was beginning to read the location the way you read a physical process written into steel, into distance, into the distribution of remains. Down there, Titanic was no longer just memory. It was evidence, and evidence is usually less romantic and much harder to face. When the smaller objects enter the frame of interpretation, everything changes scale. Dishes, coal, shoes, fittings, and other ordinary items restore to Titanic a dimension that the sheer grandeur of the hull alone cannot carry. Suddenly, the site stops being only structure and becomes a lived environment again. And that lands differently, because now we are no longer looking only at engineering, accident, and depth. We are looking at interrupted routine. at material life frozen on the ocean floor. This is one of the strongest points in the entire case. The smaller details do not reduce the story. They deepen the human weight of what happened there. On board, the effect of those images went far beyond technical satisfaction. The atmosphere changed. What had once been operational tension began to turn into a heavier kind of silence. Finding the ship is an achievement. Understanding that you are looking at a place of human loss on a real scale is something else entirely. That psychological shift matters because it prevents the discovery from becoming empty celebration. The team begins to realize they are not looking at a visual trophy. They are looking at a space charged with absence. And once that realization sets in, the posture changes. Observation becomes more restrained, more careful, and the meaning of the mission matures immediately. At that moment, the site stops being seen only as a scientific landmark and begins to be treated also as a maritime grave. Not because of dramatic wording, but because of what the objects, the empty spaces, and the overall distribution of the field reveal. Titanic was not simply a famous disaster. It was a site of mass death preserved at tremendous depth, and that changes the ethics of looking altogether. The discovery could no longer be approached like a simple archaeological storage room. The record had to carry respect, restraint, and awareness of what was being observed. The science remained there, of course, but now it shared space with a very clear moral obligation. This is where restraint becomes an essential part of the story itself. The team could observe, map, document, and analyze. But that did not mean turning the location into an inventory of possession. And that choice carries real weight. Because scientific curiosity, when it encounters a site like this, always risks crossing the line between understanding and intrusion. What makes this discovery stronger is precisely the point at which it accepts the boundary. To document without violating, to study without turning everything into an object to be owned. There is a real maturity in that. And maybe one of the most serious things the mission revealed lies not in what it showed, but in what it consciously left undisturbed. In the end, this stretch of the expedition brings forward a question that still matters today. How far is exploration knowledge, and at what point does it become intrusion? Titanic puts that question on the table in a very direct way. Because down there, on the floor of the Atlantic, there was not only historical evidence, there was material memory of a human tragedy. And that demands limits. The greatness of the mission lies not only in reaching the site, it also lies in recognizing that the presence of technology does not erase the duty of respect. In some cases, the best way to understand is to resist the urge to touch, move, or turn everything into spectacle. Not everything the expedition recorded received the same place in the public image. The bow, of course, became the symbol. It was powerful, immediate, recognizable. But many of the most revealing images were photographs that seemed less striking at first glance. Fields of objects, fragments, partial structures, and zones of dispersion did not carry the same iconic appeal, but they were essential to understanding the site. That happens often in major discoveries. What circulates best is not always what explains best. In Titanic's case, part of the truth remained at the edges of popular memory, not because it was unimportant, but because it demanded more reading, more context, and less visual simplification. From that point on, two versions of Titanic begin to coexist. On one side, the imagined Titanic, whole, clean in memory, almost arranged by popular culture. On the other, the discovered Titanic, fragmented, scattered, loaded with material reality, gaps, and historical weight. And that contrast is one of the strongest engines of the video, because no one has to lie for an image to be incomplete. The symbolic image of the bow is real, but it is not enough. The real Titanic demands surroundings, context, the distribution of remains, ethics, and critical reading. This is where the 1985 discovery stops being only a visual answer and becomes a profound correction of collective imagination. The historical force of the mission becomes clear when you realize it did not merely locate a famous wreck. It reoriented the way the wreck would be studied. The seafloor offered physical ground for revising hypotheses, reorganizing interpretations, and treating the disaster with much stronger material grounding. That changes the game completely. Because from that point forward, Titanic no longer depends only on testimony, theoretical reconstruction, and cultural memory. Evidence begins to enter the conversation in a decisive way. And once that happens, the more convenient versions of the story begin to lose their grip. What the mission found was not just a place, it was a new level of understanding. There is something deeply powerful in the idea that the seafloor acted, at the same time, as an agent of destruction and as a time capsule. The Titanic found in 1985 was corroded, altered, and fragmented, of course. But even so, it still preserved small signs of another era with astonishing force. Everyday objects, patterns of use, recognizable materials, and spatial arrangements gave the site extraordinary documentary value. It is almost hard to believe. The ocean erased a great deal, but it also preserved enough to allow a rich historical reading. And it is exactly that combination of loss and endurance that makes the site such a powerful material witness to the disaster. After all that expansion of context, the bow returns to the center with a different weight. It is still the most recognizable image of the discovery, but it no longer works as a complete summary. It now carries everything already revealed around it: debris, separation, objects, ethics, silence, absence. That changes the image entirely. the bow is no longer just the famous photograph of the ship found again. It becomes a kind of gateway into everything the public did not see when they stopped at that image alone. And maybe that is why it remains so powerful. Not because it is beautiful, but because it holds an enormous historical burden. Even after the discovery, much remained unresolved. And far from weakening the mission, that reinforces its seriousness. Because discovery does not mean closure. It means improving the quality of the questions. Some answers came with tremendous material force. Others remained partial. Still others demanded new readings, new comparisons, and new caution. There is an important honesty in that. The video needs to preserve that all the way to the end. The Titanic found in 1985 did not magically solve Titanic. It pulled the case out of the territory of total absence and placed it into the far more demanding field of ongoing investigation. An ongoing investigation almost never offers complete comfort. "40 years later, the 1985 discovery still resonates because it did not deliver only a technical milestone. It redefined how the case would be remembered, studied, and represented. Museums, archives, documentaries, books, and later debates all fed on what was seen down there. The reunion with Titanic reopened the story instead of closing it, and that is far too significant to treat like a footnote. The sinking of 1912 had already entered history, but it was the 1985 mission that gave the disaster a visible material body again, complex and impossible to ignore. In a way, the story began again, right there. In the end, what the mission revealed goes far beyond a headline saying Titanic had been found. The real impact lies in the distance between the myth the world carried and the evidence the Atlantic preserved. The discovery showed that popular memory, symbolic image, and material reality do not always move together. And maybe that is why the case remains so alive.
This video was an AI historical reconstruction based on period records, created for educational and narrative purposes.
Titanic did not end when it sank. It did not end when it was located either. What 1985 truly delivered was a new way of looking at the tragedy, less comfortable, more faithful, more human, and far harder to reduce to a single image.